Hi Sky, we are Group 3 and today we will show you something new. In the previous chapter, we talked about what arguments are and how we can distinguish them from non-arguments. In this chapter, we introduce some basic logical concepts needed to distinguish good arguments from bad ones. In evaluating any argument, we should always ask two key questions. First, are the premises true? Second, do the premises provide good reason to accept the conclusion?
First, we will come with deduction and induction. Traditionally, arguments have been divided into two types: deductive arguments and inductive arguments. All arguments claim to provide support, that is, evidence or reasons, for their conclusion. But arguments differ greatly in the amount of support they claim to provide. So, they are deductive arguments. Prove their conclusion with rigorous and inescapable logic, while inductive arguments show that their conclusions are plausible or likely given the premises. Examples of deductive arguments: all humans are mortal. Socrates is human. Therefore, Socrates is moral. Notice how the conclusions of these arguments flow from the premises with a kind of inescapable logic. Each argument's conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. Arguments are deductive when their premises are intended to provide this kind of rigorous, airtight logical support for their conclusion. Deductive arguments claim to provide logically conclusive grounds for their conclusion. That is, they attempt to show that their conclusions must be true given the premises asserted. Inductive arguments, on the other hand, simply claim that their conclusions are likely or probable given the premises offered. Here are some examples. Polls show that 75% of Republicans favor a school waiver amendment. Joe is Republican. Therefore, Joe likely favors the school waiver amendment. And every ruby so far discovered has been red, so probably all rubies are red. It is often said that the difference between deduction and induction is that deduction moves from general premises to particular conclusions, whereas induction moves from particular premise to general conclusion. That, however, is a misconception. Here, for example, is a deductive argument that moves not from general premises to a particular conclusion, but from particular premises to general conclusion. Lincoln was president from 1861 to 1865. This is particular premise. So, all people born during Lincoln's presidencies were born in the 19th century. This is general conclusion. And here is an example of an inductive argument that moves from general premises to a particular conclusion. All of Stephen King's previous novels have been good. This is general premise. So therefore, Stephen King's next novel will probably be good. This is particular conclusion. In fact, it is possible to find examples of any possible combination of general or particular premises or conclusion in deductive or inductive arguments. It is mistake to regard any particular pattern of general or particular statement as a defining characteristic or deductive or inductive reasoning. What makes an argument deductive or inductive is not the pattern of particularities or generalities in the premises and conclusion. Rather, it is the type of support that premises are claimed to provide for the conclusion. The following list summarizing the key differences between deductive and inductive reasoning. Key differences between deductive and inductive arguments. First, in deductive argument claim that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true, while the inductive argument claim that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is properly true. The conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. When in the inductive argument, the conclusion follows properly from the premises. While deductive argument claim that it is impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion fails. But the inductive argument say that it is unlikely for the premises to be true and the conclusion fails. So, in the deductive argument, it is logically inconsistent to assert the premises and deny the conclusion. If you accept the premises, you must accept the conclusion. Why? The inductive arguments claim that although it is logically consistent to assert the premises and deny the conclusion is properly true if the premises are true.
How can we tell whether an argument is deductive or inductive? We have seen that an argument is deductive if its premises are intended to provide conclusive ground for the truth of its conclusion, and inductive if its premises are intended to provide merely probable ground for the truth of its conclusion. But it is not always easy to know what a given speaker or writer intends. Fortunately, there are four tests that greatly simplify the task of determining whether an argument should be regarded as deductive or inductive: the indicator word test, the strict necessity test, the common pattern test, the principle of charity test. The indicator word test. Just as we use indicator word to signal the assertion or premises or conclusion, we use indicator word to signal when our arguments are deductive or inductive. Here are some other common deduction indicator words. Certainly, it logically follows that. Definitely, it is illogical to conclude that. Induction indicator word. Probably, one would expect that. Likely, it is a good bet that. The indication word test often extremely helpful. Nevertheless, true limitations of the test should be known. First, many arguments contain no deduction or induction indicator word. Example: if you count a dead tail a leg, how many legs does it have? Answer: 4. Calling a tail a leg doesn't make it a leg. Second, arguments often use indicator word loosely or improperly. Example: it must be clear that, and it's illogical to assume that when the context makes clear that the argument is not intended to be strictly deductive.
Such a necessity test or deductive argument claim, evasively or implausibly, that their conclusion flows necessarily from their premise. Moreover, more arguments don't offer obviously bad deductive arguments, and thus more arguments don't offer logically conclusive arguments. unless that means to offer logically conclusive argument. From this simple fact, we can usually determine whether an argument is meant to be deductive or inductive. Strict necessity take an argument conclusion as follows with strict logical necessity from a premise or it doesn't. A. Strict necessity take if the argument conclusion does follow with strict logical necessity from a premise, the argument should always be treated as deductive. B. Strict necessity take if the argument conclusion doesn't follow with strict logical necessity from a premise, the argument should normally be treated as inductive. Exception to strict necessity take an argument in which the conclusion doesn't follow necessarily from the premise should nonetheless be treated as deductive if either A or B. Exception to strict necessity take A. The language or context makes clear that the argument intended to offer a logically conclusive argument, but the argument in fact is not logically conclusive. Exception to strict necessity take B. The argument has pattern of reasoning that is characteristically deductive and nothing else about the argument indicates clearly that argument is meant to be inductive.
The common pattern text.
Deductor and inductor arguments often occur in characteristic detailed pattern of reasoning. We can apply the common pattern test to determine which kind of reasoning we are dealing with. Consider this argument. If we are in Paris, then we are in France. We are in Paris, therefore we are in France. This argument follows a pattern of format that is common in deductive reasoning. This argument follows a typical pattern. If the first assertion is true, the second statement is true. The first assertion is correct. As a result, the second assertion is correct. Because talking about the first statement, the second statement, and so on is difficult and wordy, logicians usually employ letters to represent the various elements of an argument. Let's say the letter A represents the place. We are in Paris, and the letter B represents the place. We are in France. The main pattern of argument can therefore be thought as follows. If A is true, then B is true. This is an argument pattern that logicians call modus binding, a Latin expression that means affirmative mode because it is self-evident that it is a logically sound pattern of reasoning. All argument based on it should be viewed as deductive. One of the more prevalent deductive reasoning patterns is modus binding. We will go over a few more frequent deductive and inductive thinking patterns later in this chapter. When you've mastered the recognition of such pattern, it will be simple to spot daily example deductive and inductive reasoning.
The principle of clarity test. The principle of clarity demands that one interprets a speaker's statement in the most rational way possible. When ascribing to this principle, you must consider the strongest possible interpretation of your fellow interlocutors argument before stretching it to evaluation. The principle of clarity serves two important goals in critical thinking. First, it fosters goodwill and mutual understanding in agreement by demanding that we treat the arguments of others with the same generous and respectful spirit. Second, it promotes the discovery of trust by insisting that we confirm arguments that we ourselves admit to be the strongest and most plausible versions of those arguments. Let's apply the principle of clarity test to an actual example. Andy told me that he ate at Missing's restaurant yesterday, but Missing was completely destroyed by fire less than a month ago. It is certain, therefore, that Andy is either lying or mistaken. Let's apply our various tests. First, we have also seen that people often use indicator words, especially deduction indicator words, loosely or improperly. So this first test, though it clearly suggests that the argument is meant to be deductive, shouldn't be treated as conclusive. Second, conclusions do not comply with the necessary regulations from the establishment. Third, arguments are not necessarily typical deductive or inductive arguments. In this case, we are in doubt as to whether the argument should be treated as deductive or inductive. But if we treat the argument as deductive, it is clearly a bad deductive argument because the conclusion plainly does not follow necessarily from the premise. On the other hand, if we treat the argument as inductive, the argument is a good inductive argument because the premise, if true, do make the conclusion likely. Thus, the more charitable way to interpret the argument is to interpret it as inductive. This is what the principle of clarity requires that we do. A word of caution, however, the principle of clarity should never be used to reinterpret bad arguments as good ones. The principle of clarity is a principle of interpretation, not a principle of argument repair. It should not be used to when it is clear what arguments has actually been put forward.
Exceptions to the strict necessity test. We saw earlier that an argument should generally be treated as inductive if its conclusion does not follow necessarily from its premises. Therefore, however, exceptions to this general rule, two broad exceptions should be noted. The language or context made clear that the arguer intended to offer a logically conclusive argument, but the argument, in fact, is not logically conclusive. The argument has a pattern of reasoning that is characteristically deductive, and nothing else about the argument indicates clearly that the argument is meant to induce me. Here is an example of the first exception. Here the phrase is necessarily follow that indicates that the argument is meant to be deductive. In this case, however, it is clear that the conclusion does not follow necessarily from the premises, because because it could still be possible for a ship to soar around the world if the Earth were, say, exact or cylindrical rather than spherical. Here is an example of second exception. This is a terrible argument. The premises provide no support whatsoever for the conclusion, much less logically conclusive support. How to distinguish deductive from inductive arguments? If the conclusion does not follow necessarily from the premises, the argument should be treated as inductive unless the language or content of the arguments make clear that the argument is deductive or the argument has a pattern or reasoning that is characteristically deductive. If the argument has a pattern or reasoning that is characteristically deductive, the argument should be treated as deductive unless there is clear evidence that the argument is intended to be inductive. Arguments often contain indicator words like properly, necessarily, and certainly that provide clue is determining whether an argument is deductive or inductive. If there is significant doubt about whether an argument is deductive or inductive, always interpret the argument in the ways most favorable to the arguer.
Thank you everyone for listening to our book presentation.